much. Thank you, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here today. Oops, I have something showing here. What should I press? This one? Okay. So thanks for joining me today. I'm thrilled, and I know there are several people joining us from online and Zoom as well. I'm really thrilled to be discussing some of these ideas that have really propelled me to France. So I'm looking forward to doing what I hope will be a comparative study of much of what we'll talk about today. And for the questions, I really hope that will evolve into more of a discussion. So I'm really interested in some of your understandings of sustainability and some of what you think might be most relevant when we're looking at organizational authenticity in that context when you're considering a French headquartered company. So the social construction of organizational authenticity by stakeholders, I'm going to get into a little bit of that detail and then some of the empirics and some of the findings and insights, but I'll give you a little of the research background. I'll share some of the methods, findings and insights, pretty standard, and then some of my anticipated next steps. And again, then I hope we'll have a nice, robust discussion. So to set the stage, I think this is really what has driven this set of queries for me. What is real? How is one to know? These are among the most ancient of questions. And an important arena for interacting around these ideas of what is real and how is one to know is when you take individuals, people, stakeholders, and organizations. And what's real about an organization, as far as my interests, are, at least over the last decade or so, claims of a sustainability identity. So that's really the context we're going to talk about. And particularly because there has been a lot of, I think, concern about corporate cologne and greenwashing in that context. Okay, so issues of organizational authenticity. You're all probably familiar with some of these companies or these scandals, particularly around sustainability types of claims, but there's the BP. Again, this goes back a decade or more. The Lego Shell partnership. Everything is not awesome, right? When Shell was digging in the Arctic. Nestle, which claims to be highly sustainable, but there have been issues with its child labor. And then again, in the US, a nice example of this is Goldman Sachs, who've always claimed to have a very deep culture of care, and yet there have been indications and evidence that they're very willing to throw their clients in front of the bus, so to speak, if it means a higher return or profit for them. You also have the pharmaceuticals, so you have someone like Pfizer. One of Pfizer's core claims is that of equity, and yet they've also gone ahead and partnered with companies like Mylan, which is the EpiPen producer. They, if you're not aware of that, had raised their price ×4, ×5 to make a profit. And again, coming through the last decade or so, the emission scandal with Volkswagen, and all the way up to the almost present day when you have the CEO of Danone, who was widely respected and acknowledged to be a leader both for the company and as a CEO on the climate platform, being ousted for being too sustainable, right? So then this all raises questions of authenticity when you have these companies claiming to be all about sustainability, or it's what drives who they are or their core values. So there's this motivating gap on the theory side. Research has predominantly focused on the authenticity of individuals. So there hasn't been much research around the authenticity of organizations. So this research examines just that, in particular, how a constellation of stakeholding actors build understandings about the authenticity of an organization. So just to sensitize some of the ideas, so what is authenticity? It deals with interpretations and considerations of who or what a focal entity is. We know a lot of things about authenticity in sort of a general organizational context, but again, not so much in how stakeholders come to understand the authenticity of an organization. We know it's complex and multidimensional. We know it involves this distinguishing between surface appearances and underlying reality, that it includes internal and external perspectives, and it depends also on reference of what it means to actually be real. It's become an increasingly important consideration in organizational life. We know that it's expected and demanded by stakeholders. That's been the case ever, probably again, the last decade plus. In this new world of business, companies and leaders will have to show authenticity, fairness, transparency, and good faith. If they don't, customers and employees may come to distrust them, to potentially disastrous effect. So what? So why does authenticity matter, particularly in the organizational context? Well, it matters to stakeholders, right? It matters in terms of trust. It matters in terms of quality of relationship. It impacts stakeholders' willingness to engage, whether it's their employees, investors, consumers, suppliers, other partners, et cetera. So they're asking, is the organization really what it represents itself to be? And can it be counted on to conduct itself accordingly? It also matters to organizations. So we know that from existing research, attributions of authenticity tend to strengthen things like productivity and performance. And that also relates to economic success. In general, authenticity, I would say, sustains or constrains the fabric of organizing, and that goes across all dimensions of organizing for firms, operations, production, investment, transaction, and partnerships. So organizations should be asking or are asking, how do our stakeholders understand a particular characteristic or value as representative of what we're all about? It matters to organizational scholars. I'm one of those. There's a lot of work on organizational identity, and this relates to organizational identity, but also extends it to explore the interpretations of an organization's identity by various audiences. And it relates to other ideas, again, in this sort of ecosystem of identity, sense-making, congruence seeking, social construction, plausibility, and validation of organizational identity. So how do stakeholders attend to and generate meaning about the real nature or essence of an organization is fundamentally where my research question takes us today. So just again, very briefly, some of the study basics, and then we'll get into some of the insights. I'll also take you through a bit of the method because I think it's interesting maybe to some of you. So organizational authenticity fundamentally deals with meaning making about the identity of an organization, and it involves stakeholder interpretations of a focal quality or characteristic as representative of the nature or essence of an organization. So the research questions, how do key stakeholders interpret sustainability for an organization? I'm saying that sustainability is that focal quality that's being assessed. And then how do they come to understand the authenticity? So not just what is this sustainability thing, but how is this company authentic in this context? And also, and we may or may not have time today to talk about this, but I do have some slides. How do authenticity understandings differ by stakeholder group? It turns out they do tend to differ from a comparative perspective. Okay, so again, just basics. What's social construction? It's really the premise that reality arises from the perceptions and enactments of people in relationship with other people or other organizations. And then stakeholders, I think many of you are familiar now with the term stakeholder, but individuals or groups who have various interests with a company, typically a firm, an organization, who affect or are affected by the organization's activities. So stakeholders might be employees for internal, external, maybe investors, maybe community members, maybe members of the media. Okay, very briefly, the sustainability context. And this is where we're going to get a bit more nuanced and also maybe some room for discussion at the end. So the baseline that I went into the study with was this idea that sustainability is about responsibly meeting current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In practice and scholarship, what you'll find is that there are a wide range of meanings attributed to sustainability. and typically involve both ecological, perhaps social, as well as economic concerns. It can be interpreted very differently by different groups and may be differentially meaningful. So it may have different levels of salience depending on which stakeholder group you might belong to. And lastly, this idea of greenwashing, which I touched on earlier, this idea that there is skepticism about claims typically or marketing around sustainability as essential to the identity or the core value or the DNA of a company or an organization. Okay, just a few key, I would say, pre-insights about organizational authenticity. This is what I went into this study feeling like, okay, maybe this is what might be going on. Similar to sustainability interpretations, we know authenticity is considered by both internal and external stakeholders potentially, that these interpretations or understandings can differ. And not only that, but there could be many differences, right? There are many different stakeholder groups of an organization. There was also this sort of fundamental, I think, idea that I had that authenticity was going to be built based on sort of congruence or lack of congruence between these three, call them dimensions: the identity or the who, the claims, what companies or firms were saying, right, or say, and then what they were actually doing, the do. So this do, say, who, I was pretty sure there would be some, they would be building blocks of authenticity for stakeholders. I also, again, when I started this journey, understood or thought I understood that walking the talk was going to be an important piece of authenticity construction. I think that's probably familiar to many of you even now, right? So are they doing what they say they're doing or who they say they are? There's even another motivating gap that I want to touch on before I go much further, and that's the application. It also is my normative assumption. So, I study ethics. So I think it's important as a scholar to put out my normative assumptions there. I fundamentally believe and hope that management and enterprise can actually be positive leverage points for transformational change, positive transformational change, both in society and regarding the environment. So I have this idea that, and like many of you probably share with me, there's a sense that key stakeholders are increasingly scrutinizing these sustainability claims, identity claims of organizations. And there's also the sense that stakeholders now function as highly influential pulse points as well as watchdogs for organizations. So it's really important, as far as I'm concerned, to gain a really clear understanding of these stakeholder interpretations of sustainability. In this case, this is the authenticity context I'm interested in, as well as their perceptions of what it takes to actually enact sustainability in an authentic way. This, in turn, can help firms move that needle toward doing sustainability better, right? Integrating it more holistically as part of who they are. So that's the normative set of assumptions I'm going into this as motivation. So just to step back for a second and just talk a little bit about the study context and the method. So the design was qualitative, so primarily interviews as well as interpretive. It was a grounded theory approach because we really don't know much about how stakeholders construct authenticity, well suited to how actors construct meaning out of that intersubjective experience. Single case study. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Big C, which is the case organization. And the unit of analysis that I used to focus on authenticity construction were authenticity interpretive occasions. So those are actually generated by the stakeholders, often events about or significant occasions that made them think about the authenticity of the company, in this case, in a sustainability context. The data overview, so I used purposive sampling. That meant that some stakeholders I would interview because I had a sense that they had something important or interesting, relevant to say. In some cases, I did some randomized sampling, but within stakeholder groups. And then there was also some snowball sampling. On the authenticity construction insights that we'll get to in a little bit, those were based on 77 semi-structured interviews, as well as my field notes, including 3 field trips over about a year period of time for about a week and a half each trip. 37 of the interviews were in person and 40 were by phone. And there were 5 key stakeholder groups that I focused on and that build toward the authenticity constructions we'll talk about in a bit. So those were employees, including sustainability leaders. So those tended to be more high-level folks at the firm, and then operational employees who tended to be distributed throughout the company's operations at headquarters. There was a community advisory panel that I was granted access to by the organization. So I was able to talk with these folks. These are stakeholders who are both invited to join the company or by each other or by the firm to serve as, again, a bit of a pulse point between the community and the organization. So they go back out to the community and help the community understand what's going on at the firm. Meanwhile, they also help the firm understand what's going on in the community. I spoke with investors, both traditional and ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as well as some environmental interest groups and some regulators. As a result, all of these conversations led to 205 AIOs, which are authenticity interpretive occasions. I'll talk about those in a bit. 129 favorable, 48 unfavorable, and on average, each stakeholder talked about between 2 and 3 or more authenticity interpretive occasions. So I also used archival data sources to corroborate some of my findings. So the website, the annual reports, media, independent books and reports, case studies that have been published already. Additionally, and this is just briefly, although the 77 participants and 5 key groups led to the authenticity construction piece, I also interviewed 27 other participants from different stakeholder groups. And these groups actually in these interviews led to some of the sustainability interpretation findings. So I've included them here. So some of their partners, some folks in the media, some independent sustainability experts, and even one non-headquarter employee chimed in. But in total, with everybody included, I spent about 4.5 days interviewing folks over that period of time and then analyzing it, which, as you know, takes quite a bit longer. So we transcribed, coded, analyzed, which I'll share some of those insights shortly. So the study site, I'll just quickly say, Big C is what I'm calling it, US-based Fortune 500 global manufacturer, an old, well-established company, 50,000 plus employees worldwide, 100 years old. Interestingly, it comes from a dirty, i.e. controversial industry where there's a very heavy reliance on traditional plant operations. This company happens to be a big consumer of natural resources and a big producer of industrial waste. And again, controversial, they have a storied history of some high-profile issues. They also happen to have a very extensive product portfolio that touches consumers pretty much everywhere, all around the world, and for years have done that, but they're not known as that type of company. So why did I pick Big C? So they were all about, in their annual reports, on their website, were all about sustainability. Was very central as far as how they identified themselves. They focus on sustainability. It's embedded in everything we do, operation, strategy, innovation, et cetera. It was listed as one of their strategic themes. It was listed as 2 of their 3 core values. And then they also, at that time, which was a bit rare, had a chief sustainability officer who was one of 12 top executives. So it did seem like they were really working hard to have this sustainability identity. Okay, so the analysis, and I'm not going to talk about all of it necessarily, but there were 3 major undertakings. So identifying the interpretive terrain of sustainability. So what does sustainability mean to all of these different stakeholders? Then cataloging and categorizing authenticity interpretive occasions. So again, I'll take you through a little bit of this, but leading to these events in which I could analyze how stakeholders came to understand authenticity for the organization. And then how do these authenticity interpretations or understandings differ by stakeholder group? So the first research question, which really gets to that sustainability interpretive terrain, I'm just giving you an example of one of the key prompts. I also did a lot of probes. Big C talks about this. Sustainability is an important part of who the company is. What's your sense of what sustainability means for Big C? So I'm really just opening it up for each participant to share their sense of what this means for this company. And I'm just going to give you two quotes just briefly to set the stage that this really is a varied set of interpretive interpretations. So one, the CAP member, so that's the Community Advisory Panel member, I think, like I said, people don't really know what it means. You can talk, you could grab 3 experts. They probably all define it a little bit differently. And then another, again, external stakeholder from an environmental interest group. I mean, sustainability is just, I mean, it's a fairly complicated concept. So even when you go and you talk to some of these folks, they're a little bit sometimes either uncertain about what it means, unwilling to kind of put a nail or two in what they think this means for this company. But in general, this sort of sets the stage for how varied sustainability interpretations work. Very, very simplistically, there were 3 main dimensions of how sustainability was interpreted for this company by stakeholders: environmental, organizational, and societal. I think we all now are familiar with environmental and societal. Organizational would really imply, like, can the company actually sustain itself and continue to exist? Which was actually a little bit humbling for me as a scholar, going in with this, you know, enlightened sense of how this company was going to, you know, was understood to be helping the environment or helping society or helping communities. And really, a lot of people were thinking about sustainability for this organization in terms of, is the company going to be around next year? Am I going to get a paycheck from this company? You know, are investors going to continue to invest in it? Will it be an ongoing concern? Okay, so I'm not sure that you can see this, and I'm not sure that you need to see it, but on the organizational field, so again, this is sort of that big picture view. This drills it down a little bit more as far as how some of the coding went. But people talked about operational sustainability within this organization, as well as strategic sustainability, and lots of different ideas here, right? Are they open to discussion? Are they managing their image? Are they making significant investing and acquiring activities with regard to sustainability? So a lot of people had a lot of different ideas about what sustainability meant for this company. And I organized it into within that organizational, operational, and strategic. That's what the coding seemed to indicate. Within environmental, again, we don't need to pause here for too long, but just to explain a little bit, environmental split into eco-operational, as well as more general. And the general was more about sort of this indeterminate environmental concern, which may be like very broad, from considering the environment to much more specific, like being environmentally friendly or taking care of the environment. I mean, it's not much more specific, but this was sort of by level of proactivity, considering versus finally down at the bottom, protecting. And then within eco-operational, I mean, just a ton. Again, this is a major consumer products company, not known for that, tons of operations. So on the eco-operational side, there were a lot of considerations by stakeholders. And then as far as the social dimension, really most stakeholders are talking about the community, and by community, they were really meaning like the neighborhood, right, of where this headquarters was located, the community there, as well as, again, this sort of more general idea of improving quality of human life or giving back globally. So really community versus global was, or general, how that came through. Okay, and I'm We're going to get back into the details for a second, but this is really just to show you how I was able to think about sustainability interpretive domains by stakeholder groups. So the inner band, which I'm not sure if you can see, but the one closest to the white center are employees. And then the next band are the community advisory panel members, then the environmental interest groups, the investors, and the regulators. And what this is basically showing is how do each of these stakeholder groups interpret sustainability. And so, for instance, you have environmental, eco-operational. All stakeholder groups are in some way, someone within those groups are talking about sustainability as eco-operational. When you get to like social general, there are actually two groups, investors and regulators, who don't even think about like broad general societal impacts as sustainability for this company. So that's what you're looking at here, really just to show you that different stakeholder groups do think about different aspects of sustainability for this company, at least in an interpretive manner. And then this drills back into the details a little bit. You have the same bands, but here I've pulled out all of the different smaller dimensions of societal, which didn't have any smaller dimensions, right? The strategic, the operational for the organization, the environmental and the eco-operational side, et cetera. So you get like a much finer grained view of what different stakeholder groups are talking about when they're talking about interpretations of sustainability. Okay. So there's a lot of variation is really the bottom line here in sustainability interpretations by stakeholders. Okay. Tons of variation. Diverse, distinctive, nuanced understandings held by different members of stakeholder groups and subgroups. There's interpretive convergence. So some stakeholder groups think of sustainability in the same way as others. And then it's particularly important. So why? Why did I take you through this? Because I had to understand how they were interpreting sustainability before I could understand how they were understanding or constructing authenticity. So stakeholder interpretations of sustainability fundamentally anchor their authenticity meaning-making process. Okay, and we can always go back and talk about sustainability interpretations. What I'll say just briefly is what's missing here because of the time period that the data was collected. There's not much on climate action, right? Which I think is what a lot of the conversation would be now. There's not much, so this was pre-Greta Thunberg when this data was collected. There's not much on social justice. So it's also pre sort of the Black Lives Matter platform movement, the tragedies, really the tragedies of that. There's really not much, again, this is a US company, but as far as what's happening in Europe, and they did have European operations, but I was only talking to people at headquarters. There wasn't much about migration, right, or the refugee crisis. I think that is now a much more salient aspect of the sustainability conversation. So I'm eager to hear or see how that might come to play in the field study I will be doing here. Okay, just turning to the authenticity interpretive occasions. So this is just some of the prompts and the questions again, if you're interested, for how I got requested that participants share some of their the occasions that made them think about the authenticity of Big C in this context. Keep going here. And then we're not going to stay here, but this is just to show that there were, so authenticity interpretive occasions are AIOs. So there were 19 of these were in common. That means that 2 or more participants referenced the same or essentially the same occasion when they were talking about authenticity. There were 16 alike AIOs. Again, that's 2 or more participants talking about similar occasions, but that may have occurred at different points in time. And then finally, there were 36 unique authenticity interpretive occasions. So only one participant identified these authenticity interpretive occasions. So what does this show? There are numerous potentially very high salience occasions that spur constructions of authenticity. And while some of them may be highly public events and or controversies, Some of them are much more organizational specific, and some are just purely personal experiences, so that unless you are asking someone questions, you might not ever hear about that story. So a lot of authenticity construction happens, again, based on sort of ranging from highly public to highly personal experiences. Okay, so findings overview, and then, yeah, we're still good on time. So not surprisingly, key stakeholders do talk about this do, say, and who, right? So we sort of expected that. No surprise probably for anyone here. It's that walking the talk, also mapped to that fundamental sort of sense of identity. So this is how that looks when you drill into the authenticity interpretive occasions. Stakeholders are talking about the do, right? The actions as far as actions, practices, engagement, and resistance. We're talking just basically about discourse, what's the company saying, and then who is usually a conversation around identity or culture. What was interesting, and this is what I want to spend more time on, is that stakeholders also consider an organization's authenticity in terms of the how and the why. And you can think of how as a bit of an extension of the do, the actions, but it really drills into that in depth. And then why was a surprise to me, actually. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So the how has to do with attitude, attention, and intention, as well as strategic and operational integration. And the why addresses things like institutional imperative, image management, and ethics. And so I have some examples for each of these. I'm not going to spend much time on, or really any time on do, say, who. I think what's really, really interesting is the how and the why, and how that's considered in authenticity constructions. And by the way, so there were favorable and unfavorable constructions of authenticity along each of these dimensions and core components, except for resistance. Resistance was always unfavorable, right? If you were thinking that an organization was resistant to sustainability, it's always unfavorable. If you're thinking about sustainability as core to identity, it's almost always a positive or favorable construction. Otherwise, there are both favorable and unfavorable constructions of authenticity. Okay. So this is the do and the how. This is just to show you basically for favorable constructions of authenticity, how I did some of the coding. So from first order concepts to more organizing themes. So basically the statements that were made for first order concepts for action would deal with how, not how they're doing it, but have they done it? What have they accomplished? Are they comparing what they've done to others? Et cetera, et cetera. So this is, again, just to show you how I did some of the coding. I'm happy to go back and talk about any of this as process or content as we go. But what I want to get to is this just, again, maps from it takes qualitative data, right? So these authenticity interpretive occasions across these dimensions, and it just shows you a bit here. So yes, the do is important, but look how important the how is, right? Like not just that they're doing it, but how they're doing it. And again, we'll drill into that in a little bit. Okay, so the how. Again, this is where I think it gets really interesting. When you talk with stakeholders about, is this organization authentic in terms of this, right? Sustainability. What you'll find for favorable is that it is not just are they doing it, but what's their attitude about it? What's their attention to it? What's their intention? So I've called this commitment. They also refer to these dimensions or components of commitment in terms of unfavorable constructions as well. Okay, and then here are some examples quickly. So attitude, right? Perception that the organization cares, is serious, has a sense of responsibility, is open to it, has a positive attitude, is persistent, is honest about the quality or performing the quality. So a favorable example. So I was like, wow, Big C really cares about the environment. They're not just this big company that doesn't care if they dump toxic waste in the river. So this was saying, no, they do care. So they are authentically sustainable. On the unfavorable side, right? So we don't have this clean river system because Here's big C that doesn't give a rat's butt about sustainability and the concept of, or the realm of a clean river system, a clean environment, a healthy community. So again, not caring in this commitment / attitude domain leads this environmental stakeholder to assess an unfavorable authenticity construction. Okay, so again, this just goes to show that a bit more of the how. In addition to commitment, there was integration as well as leadership position that led to favorable and unfavorable construction. So a couple more examples. And again, on the operational side, it's in terms of products, processes, enterprise initiatives, and structure. So favorable, I think Big C is doing its very best to make better products, smarter products that don't work against the earth, but work with it. So that leads to a favorable sense of authenticity, as well as it's just how they operate their systems, anecdotally, just how we don't want to have a release of materials or we don't find that acceptable. So that's, again, very operationally focused. On the negative side of things, if you still persist in making some products, that's an indication that you haven't seen something. So that's their product portfolio. Also, if you're fundamentally committed to a process that's creating persistent, actually, it was a certain process, that I added process that's creating persistent bioaccumulative chemicals at production at disposal. I don't think that's ultimately sustainable. So again, this product process also leads to unfavorable constructions of authenticity. And then leadership position, they made it to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. That isn't to be sneezed at. So that's, taking a leadership role, something that leads to authenticity construction. Being influential in this groundbreaking partnership, also influential from a leadership perspective, unfavorable. They're not showing they're a leader in environmental stewardship, or by going with the substance, they've not only affected their own production, but arguably directed the entire North American industry toward this higher R value product, right? And global warming potential. So they're basically the opposite of a leader here. Okay, and lastly, why? Okay, so I think, did I have a picture there? So for the why, and again, this was not expected. I wasn't expecting sort of these types of motivations to be part of the authenticity construction of stakeholders. The institutional imperative, image management, and ethics as motivations for doing or not doing are essentially what I've coded as the why. So the institutional imperative here, perceptions of drivers related to these, especially in terms of standards or regulations, economic forces or social forces. And this is interesting. So here's one stakeholder saying, no, you know what? Pop culture says everything's green and environmental, whether that's, it's on people's minds, from soccer moms to retirees. Everyone's committed to this and that kind of stuff. So it's popular, it's trendy. In order for a company to remain relevant, I think you have to tap into what the consumers are interested in. So what they're assessing is that this company has done that. And so this is a favorable construction of authenticity. Whereas this one on the same topic, which is right, that this has become trendy, this stakeholder is saying, well, as the community became more and more aware of this and the pervasiveness of it, and the extent of it, I think Big C was afraid the public was going to get really, really disgusted with them. So here they're saying, okay, so they did it because it's popular, right? And only because it's popular. So, and finally, ethics on the favorable side, right? Being a good neighbor. So I think they try to be a good neighbor. They try to be a good community member. It's their neighborhood, it's their backyard. And unfavorable, as far as ethics goes, there was a sense that there was a moral and ethical way to conduct oneself and that the company wasn't doing that. So again, right, it's complicated because you have these components. Different stakeholders may have favorable or unfavorable authenticity constructions or sense of what's going on. And it's all also going back to what their original understandings of sustainability even was. Okay. So I did ask the question, so how do different stakeholder groups differ or how are they similar with regard to authenticity construction? This is on the favorable authenticity construction side. I basically coded down for how each of the stakeholder groups within those components understood authenticity construction favorably. And each column does differ, so they're not sort of equally weighted as far as how the stakeholder group is understanding authenticity. Similarly, in the unfavorable group, what's interesting here is sustainability leaders in the company and traditional investors do not think that there are any unfavorable authenticity occasions for this company. Okay, again, maybe not surprisingly, but here it is, right out there. Okay, so comparing these of the top 5 most influential authenticity constructions by stakeholder group, strategic and integration, which goes into that how, is definitely a front runner. So both in unfavorable and favorable constructions, stakeholders are thinking about strategic integration, not just is the company doing it, but how are they doing it and how are they doing it within strategically within the company. Next, actions, right? Are they doing it? That's sort of the baseline, which I was expecting to see. And sure enough, stakeholders do need to see that something is happening or is not happening as far as their authenticity constructions, or they're looking for that. So for favorable, leadership is high up on the list, and it's not on the list really at all for unfavorable, but attitude is important for unfavorable constructions. So, and then finally, resistance is also quite an obvious front runner for unfavorable constructions if the company's resisting in any way, and typically with regard to regulations. So regulatory and environmental interest group would be paying more attention to that. Okay, so back to the question, and then I think we can still have time for some good discussion. I still have a few more slides that may be interesting as well for discussion. What is real and how is one to know? So findings from this study do tell us a little bit more about the latter as far as how stakeholders understand authenticity for an organization in a sustainability identity context. I'm just going to show you this very briefly because I'm still trying to figure out kind of how to model this authenticity construction picture from, the most simplistic way I can do it that's also accurate. And there's really no true beginning or end here. I guess you could start at the interpretive occasion, which is where I really started. And that's within the interpretive context of sustainability. And then this idea that there's a number of components, there are dimensions, right? The say, who, do, how, and why, and then the individual components within there that stakeholders are thinking about. Is it congruent with what our sense of sustainability is? If it is, it tends to build more trust, confidence, support, and legitimacy, right? Which further leads to a more solidified identity in the who. If it doesn't, this distrust, doubt, opposition, illegitimacy, it certainly doesn't support the who very much and leads to probably more questions of authenticity again. Okay, so contributions. It does begin to generate some insights about how a wide variety of stakeholders understand sustainability, understand authenticity. It also begins to generate this very nuanced dimension of authenticity construction. So the say, do, who, expecting that, the how and why, and how nuanced that is I think, really interesting and exciting. It's not simple, it's not binary, it's not yes or no, right? There's a lot of gray area here. There's evidence that stakeholder groups construct authenticity in very different ways. It supports some of the organizational identity work. It begins to get really more toward this plausibility and how that, again, is generated from a stakeholder perception. And then I think it presents this idea of organizational authenticity as actually very useful for thinking about organizational reality. There are also contributions in terms of sustainability interpretations, right? It provides a very detailed view of what those look like for one company, at least at one period of time from the particular set of stakeholders I spoke with. And it comprehensively maps that terrain of sustainability interpretations. This idea of authenticity interpretive occasions, I think, is something that other studies could actually use and explore. And it's one that I'm going to be building on with a field study here. And then in practice, and I think this is what's most important, it does help organizations gain a much more nuanced sense of what its stakeholders understand about what's real about the company. So it helps them engage more effectively with stakeholders, which helps that high quality connection. It helps them better meet stakeholder expectations, enhances a lot of important things to organizations like trust and credibility, performance, reputation. It potentially can make a company more desirable for a skilled labor force that cares about these things. It also articulates specific metrics that organizations can actually start to consider when they're thinking about how can we be more authentic, right? Or if they're even questioning that, right? Especially with regard to sustainability. So, and fundamentally, I think it supports this possibility for organizations doing more and better sustainability and taking a good look at themselves. It helps organizations hold themselves accountable. It encourages self-regulation. And I would say it leverages sort of this power and potential of identity-based transformation toward good, positive ends, right? Positive environmental, positive societal impacts. And I'm going to just skim through these so you can see that these exist, but I think this is actually what might be the highest value as far as what I can offer to organizations as why this matters. There's actually an audit that organizations can do based on this research, based on all of these interviews, all 3 and 4.5 days of interviews and analysis, months and years of analysis, that organizations can actually be asking themselves. So not just, are we doing it compared to what others are doing, et cetera. Again, do isn't the most exciting framework to think about authenticity, but I think there's still some good questions companies can be asking. Similar, the say, right? Are we talking about it? Are we consistently talking about it? Are we talking consistently about it? Is our leadership talking about it? And then this, again, I think is what's more interesting and more exciting in terms of an audit that an organization or organizational leadership can do with regard to sustainability in particular. What's their attitude? And here are the questions they can be asking themselves about, about it. Here's intention, right? Are we trying hard to do it? Are we taking a proactive stance? Are we taking risks? Are we encouraging people to do it? And then attention, are we focused? Are we thoughtful? Do we make doing it important? Are we asking ourselves hard questions about doing it? Leadership role, lots of questions they can be asking themselves here. Many more operations and strategy questions. And finally, who deals with culture and identity, right? Is it part of our culture? Is it fundamental value? Is it part of our DNA into identity? And then the why. Are we doing it because there's a market imperative? Are we doing it for the ethics around it, right? Is it the right thing to do? Are we doing it before we have to do it? Are we doing it to benefit others? And then finally, image management. Are we doing it to protect our image, enhance our image? Are we doing it for more than just our image? So all sorts of fundamental questions organizations can be asking themselves around organizational authenticity in a sustainability context. But really that could be in many other contexts as well. So limitations, it's one organization, it's one interpretive context, it's a specific moment in time, it's US centric. I'm really excited to be here because I get to explore another case, and that's right now sort of in development. We're going to use the same interpretive sustainability context, although I think stakeholders here will probably have different and more nuanced ways of interpreting sustainability, particularly at this moment in time. So I'm really eager to do that type of analysis. Again, this is sort of this post-climate crisis platform, variety of other contexts, not to mention the pandemic, which I think has also influenced ideas of sustainability. I'm gonna skip over that. This just keeps it current. A variety of companies are making these very clear climate action identity claims about themselves. So that gives us all an opportunity to think about organizational authenticity in that context. this, I think I'll also just mention as something that I'm fascinated by, which is this language of authenticity construction. So I'm really looking forward to, again, how this might contrast or compare to how French headquartered company stakeholders might talk about authenticity. And there will be some interpretation nuance as well from French to English, but I know there are going to be some really interesting phrases I haven't heard before. And finally, and I guess this is one of these moments in qualitative research that sort of just makes your heart pitter patter when you have a conversation with someone and you get a detail and it puts everything in perspective. So when I was doing this data collection and I was talking with one of the investors, they said, I think most companies, when they talk about sustainability, they talk about the frou-frou stuff and this and that and this, all the stuff that makes the advertising campaign. At the end of the day, that's very little of the free cash flow. So that's kind of the stuff that makes your poster. That is, to steal a term from one of my old bosses, that's a dimple on the pimple of an ass of an ant. So I hope that that's not only what's happening in sustainability with companies, but there is certainly a sense that it might be only that. And so we certainly have a long way to go. And I think that brings us to discussion and questions. Thank you.